The tray in my hands was shaking before I even opened my mouth. I set it down on the long table in front of Damien Cole and told myself it was nothing, just a small piece of news, the kind anyone might share on an ordinary evening. "I have a date tonight," I said. "I need to leave by 6. The room did not feel ordinary anymore. Damien did not look up right away. He was reading something on his tablet, one hand resting near his coffee cup, and for a moment, I thought he had not heard me at all. Then his thumb stopped moving across the screen. He set the tablet down slowly, the way a man sets down a weapon he has decided not to use yet. "Say that again," he said. "I have a date," I repeated. "Tonight. I already asked Greta to cover the last hour of my shift." He looked at me then, and I felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before the first drop of rain falls. Damien Cole had eyes the color of wet stone, calm on the surface and impossible to read underneath. In the 8 months I had worked in his house, I had learned to watch those eyes the way sailors watch the sky. They told me more than his voice ever did. "Who is he?" Damien asked. "That is not something I need to share with my employer," I said, and I kept my voice light, because I did not want this to become a conversation. I wanted it to be a simple fact, delivered and forgotten, the way I might have mentioned that the flowers in the hallway needed water. It did not stay simple. Damien stood from his chair, and the room seemed to shrink around him the way it always did. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, dressed the way he always dressed, dark and precise, not a single thread out of place. People said many things about Damien Cole in the city, most of them in whispers, most of them involving men who owed him money or favors they could not repay. I did not ask questions about his business. I cleaned his house, prepared his meals, kept his schedule in order, and in return, I received a salary that let me pay my mother's medical bills without falling behind. That arrangement had worked for 8 months because I never crossed the invisible line between his world and mine. I felt myself crossing it now, just by mentioning a date. "Everyone who comes near this house is vetted for a reason, Claire," he said. My name in his mouth sounded different than it did from anyone else, sharper somehow, like he was testing the weight of it. "I am not bringing anyone near this house," I said. "I am going to a restaurant, across town, on my own time." "Your own time still belongs to a schedule I need to know," he said. I almost laughed, except nothing about his face suggested humor. "I have worked for you for 8 months," I said. "I have never once missed a shift. I am not asking permission. I am telling you as a courtesy, so the house is not left short-handed tonight." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere behind me, in the kitchen, I could hear Greta humming to herself as she chopped vegetables for dinner, completely unaware that the air in the front room had turned to glass. "Fine," Damien said finally. "Go on your date." The words should have felt like victory. Instead, they felt like the calm before something worse. And I was right to feel that way, because within the hour, everything about my evening began to fall apart in small, deliberate pieces. I went back to my work, certain the matter was finished. I dusted the shelves in the library, refilled the water pitcher in his office, laid out the folders he would need for his morning meetings. Each task felt normal, each motion familiar, and slowly my heartbeat returned to its usual rhythm. By 4 in the afternoon, I had convinced myself that I had imagined the tension in his voice, that a busy man with too much on his mind had simply reacted to an unexpected piece of information, nothing more. Then Damien found me in the hallway outside his study and told me, in a tone that allowed no argument, that a shipment of documents needed to be sorted and filed before the end of the day. "Important documents," he said, "legal papers that could not wait until tomorrow." I looked at the clock on the wall. It was already past 4:30. "How long will this take?" I asked. "As long as it takes to do it properly," he said, and walked away before I could ask anything else. I stood there for a moment, with my hands curled into fists at my sides, because I understood exactly what was happening, even though he had given me no proof of it. In 8 months, Damien Cole had never once handed me legal documents to sort. That was Greta's work, or the work of the 2 men in dark suits who came twice a week to handle his business papers. This was new. This was timed. I walked into his study and found a stack of folders waiting on the desk, at least 200 pages thick, unlabeled, out of order. It would have taken hours to sort properly. I looked at the folders, then at the clock, then at the folders again, and something inside me hardened into a decision. I was not going to let him win this quietly. I began sorting the papers with a speed I did not know I possessed, my fingers moving faster than my mind could fully track, separating contracts from correspondence, dates from signatures, names I recognized from names I did not. My back ached within 20 minutes. My eyes burned from reading fine print under lamplight, but I kept moving, because somewhere underneath the anger, there was a quieter thought taking shape, a thought I did not want to examine too closely. He was not doing this because he cared about legal documents. He was doing this because he did not want me to leave. At 5:15, Damien appeared in the doorway of the study, arms crossed, watching me work. He did not offer to help. He did not apologize for the sudden task. He simply stood there, studying me the way he studied everything, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces kept shifting shape. "You work quickly when you are motivated," he said. "I do not appreciate being tested," I said, without looking up. "I am not testing you," he said. "Then what would you call this?" I asked, gesturing at the folders spread across the desk like a small paper battlefield. 200 pages of documents that suddenly needed sorting an hour before I was supposed to leave. He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "The business does not stop because you have somewhere to be," he said. "The business has not stopped in 8 months," I said. "This is the first time you have handed me legal papers instead of Greta or your men in suits." Something flickered across his face then, something quick and unguarded, gone before I could name it. For a moment I thought he might actually explain himself. Instead, he turned and walked out of the study without another word, leaving me alone with the folders and my racing pulse. I finished the sorting by 5:50, faster than I had ever completed a task in that house, driven by a stubbornness that surprised even me. I stacked the folders neatly, squared their edges, and set them exactly where he would find them. A small silent statement that said, I had refused to let him control my evening, no matter what he tried. Then I went to change out of my uniform. My date was set for 7 o'clock at a small restaurant near the river, the kind of place with candles on every table and a menu written in careful cursive. I had chosen a deep green dress for the occasion, simple but elegant, something that made me feel like a woman with a life outside of scrubbing floors and answering to a man who frightened half the city. I stood in front of the small mirror in my room and told myself the evening was still mine to enjoy, regardless of what had happened in the study. I came downstairs at 6:15, my coat over one arm, my small evening bag in hand. Damien was standing near the front entrance, as if he had been waiting there for some time, though I could not imagine why. He looked at the dress, at my hair pulled back from my face, at the light touch of color on my lips, and something in his jaw tightened the exact same way it had that morning when I first mentioned the date. "You look nice," he said, and the words came out stiff, almost reluctant, as though he had not intended to say them at all. "Thank you," I said, and reached for the door. "Be careful tonight," he said suddenly, before I could step outside. "The city is not always kind after dark." "I have lived in this city my whole life," I said. "I know how to take care of myself." He did not respond to that. He simply stood there watching me leave, his expression unreadable once more, and I walked out into the cool evening air feeling his eyes on my back long after the door had closed between us. The restaurant was warm and golden, filled with the low hum of conversation and the soft clink of glasses. I sat at a small table near the window, waiting for a date that existed only in the careful lie I had told that morning, because the truth was far simpler and far more dangerous than anything I had admitted to Damien Cole. There was no man coming to meet me. I had invented the entire evening for one reason only, a reason I barely allowed myself to think about in daylight. I wanted to see what he would do. I wanted to know whether the careful distance Damien kept between us, the strict lines he drew around every interaction, would hold if he believed I was slipping away from him toward someone else. Now, sitting alone at a candlelit table with an empty seat across from me, I realized I had gotten my answer, though I still did not fully understand what it meant. A man who did not care would not have handed me 200 pages of documents an hour before I was supposed to leave. A man who did not care would not have stood in the entryway waiting to see me walk out the door. I ordered a glass of wine and told myself I would sit here for exactly 1 hour, long enough to make the lie believable, long enough to think clearly about what I had started and where it might lead. Outside the window, the lights of the city reflected off the dark surface of the river, and somewhere across town, in a house too large for one man, Damian Cole was almost certainly still thinking about me too. I did not know yet how right I was, or how much that single lie would change everything between us before the week was over. The wine had gone warm in my glass by the time I admitted to myself that sitting alone in a restaurant, pretending to wait for a man who did not exist, was not the clever plan I had believed it to be that morning. I paid my bill, pulled my coat tight around my shoulders, and stepped out into a night that had turned colder than expected. I walked instead of calling a car, because I needed the time to think, and because the streets near the river had always felt safer to me than they probably should have. The lights from the restaurants and small shops threw long shadows across the pavement, and somewhere behind me, I could hear the distant sound of traffic crossing the bridge. I replayed the entire evening in my mind, every detail of it, trying to understand what I had actually accomplished by lying to the most dangerous man I had ever met. I had wanted proof. I had gotten it, in the stack of legal documents, and the way his jaw had tightened when he saw me in that green dress. But proof of what, exactly, I still could not say with any certainty. And that uncertainty followed me the entire walk home. The house was dark when I arrived, except for a single light burning in the front room, the kind of light that told me someone was awake and waiting, even before I opened the door. I hesitated on the front step, my hand resting on the cold brass handle, and considered for a moment whether I should walk around to the side entrance instead, the one the staff used when they did not want to be noticed. It felt like cowardice even as I thought it, and I decided against it. I had started this evening with a lie bold enough to unsettle a man who unsettled everyone else in this city. I was not going to end it by sneaking through a side door like a child avoiding punishment. I opened the front door and found Damian sitting in the armchair near the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand that he had clearly not touched, judging by how full it still was. He did not look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes moved over me slowly, taking in the coat, the dress beneath it, the faint chill still clinging to my skin from the walk home. "You are back early," he said. "It is nearly 10, I said. "That is not early for a first date that went well." Something shifted in his expression at those words, something I could not fully name, though it looked uncomfortably close to relief, mixed with something sharper underneath. "Did it go well?" he asked, and his voice had an edge to it that he did not quite manage to hide. "It was a lovely evening," I said, choosing my words with care, because I had not yet decided how far I wanted to carry this particular lie. "The food was excellent, the company was pleasant." "Pleasant?" Damian repeated, as though the word tasted wrong in his mouth. "That is a strange thing to say about a man you were eager enough to rearrange your entire evening for." "I was not aware that going on a date required your approval," I said, and I heard my own voice growing sharper than I intended. He stood from the armchair then, setting the untouched glass down on the side table with more force than necessary, so that the liquid inside trembled against the crystal. "It does not require my approval," he said. "It requires common sense. You work in a house that draws attention from people who are not always kind. A stranger courting you is not a small matter, Claire. It is a risk I have to think about, whether you like it or not." I felt the familiar frustration rising in my chest, the same frustration I had carried through the entire afternoon while sorting his sudden pile of documents. "That is not what this is about," I said. "This is not about security. This is about you not wanting me to have a life outside of this house." The words hung in the air between us, more honest than I had meant them to be, and I watched something crack open in his expression, just for a moment, before he closed it off again behind that familiar calm. "You do not know what this is about," he said quietly. "Then tell me," I said, "because from where I am standing, it looks exactly like jealousy, and I did not think a man like you allowed himself to feel something so ordinary." I do not know why I said it. Perhaps it was the wine, or the walk home in the cold, or the accumulated frustration of a day spent being tested by a man who refused to admit what he was doing. Whatever the reason, The word jealousy landed in that room, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it created did not settle quickly. Damien's expression hardened into something I had not seen from him before, not anger exactly, but a kind of controlled intensity that made the room feel smaller than it actually was. "You should be careful with words like that," he said. "Why?" I asked. "Because they are close to the truth?" He crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between us, until I had to tilt my head back slightly to keep looking at him. This close, I could see details I usually missed from a safer distance: the faint scar near his left eyebrow, the tension in the muscles of his jaw, the way his eyes were not actually gray at all, but a deep, stormy blue that only looked gray in dim light. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been for a simple conversation about a fake date. "Because the truth is complicated," Damien said, his voice low. "And you have no idea what you are asking me to admit." "Then admit it," I said, and I do not know where the courage came from, except that I had already walked further into this than I could easily walk back from. "Tell me why sorting legal papers suddenly mattered more than my evening plans. Tell me why you were standing by the door when I left, and why you are sitting up waiting for me now instead of sleeping like any reasonable man would after a long day." For a moment, I thought he would actually answer me. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that made my skin feel warm, despite the chill still clinging to my coat, and I held my breath, waiting for whatever truth he had been guarding behind that careful composure of his. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, and the distance between us returned along with the familiar wall he kept around himself at all times. "It is late," he said, his voice flat again, controlled again. The moment closed as firmly as a door slamming shut. "You should get some rest. We can discuss this another time." I stood there in the front room, my coat still on, my heart still racing from a conversation that had ended before it truly began, and I felt something close to anger rise up through the disappointment. "You are impossible," I said. "I have been told that before," he said, already turning away toward the staircase. I watched him climb the stairs without looking back, his shoulders set in that same rigid line they always held, and I stood alone in the front room for several long minutes after he disappeared, trying to understand what had just happened between us. I had gone looking for proof of something, and I had found it, clear as anything, in the way he had almost let himself say the truth before pulling it back at the last possible second. That admission, however incomplete, changed something for me. I could not simply return to the careful distance we had kept for 8 months, not after seeing that flicker of real feeling behind his controlled exterior. And I suspected, though I had no proof of it yet, that Damien could not return to that distance either. I went up to my own room on the smaller staircase at the back of the house, changed out of the green dress, and lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the conversation in the front room. Somewhere down the hall, in the largest bedroom in the house, I imagined Damien was doing the exact same thing, turning our exchange over and over in his mind, searching for the version of it where he had not stopped himself from telling me the truth. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it brought with it strange, restless dreams that I could not fully remember by morning, except for the lingering sense that something between Damien and me had shifted permanently, whether either of us was ready for it or not. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, and lay in bed for a while listening to the quiet sounds of the house waking up around me. I heard Greta moving in the kitchen below, the soft clatter of pans, the smell of coffee beginning to drift up through the old floorboards. I heard, too, the distinct sound of Damien's study door opening and closing earlier than his usual schedule allowed, and I wondered what had kept him awake, or whether he had slept at all. When I finally came downstairs and began my morning duties, I found him already in his study, dressed and composed as though the previous night had never happened, as though he had not nearly admitted something enormous to me in the dim light of the front room. He glanced up when I entered with his coffee, and for just a moment, before the familiar mask settled back into place, I saw something raw and uncertain in his eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good morning," I replied, setting the coffee down beside him. Neither of us mentioned the conversation from the night before, but I noticed, as I moved around the study straightening papers and refilling the water pitcher, that his eyes followed me more closely than they ever had before, tracking my movements the way a man watches something he is afraid of losing. Later that morning, Greta cornered me in the pantry while I was counting out the week's supplies, her sharp eyes studying my face with the kind of attention only an old friend allows herself. "You look tired," she said. "And you came in later than usual last night." "I had a date," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, they felt heavier than they had the day before, less like a simple fact, and more like a secret I was carrying carefully, so it would not spill. Greta raised an eyebrow, setting down the sack of flour she had been holding. "A date," she said slowly. "And how did our employer take that particular piece of news?" I did not answer right away, and my silence told her everything she needed to know. Greta had worked in that house for nearly 6 years, long enough to understand its unspoken rules better than anyone, long enough to notice things that passed unremarked by everyone else. She leaned against the pantry shelf and crossed her arms. "He gave you extra work before you left, did he not?" she said. It was not really a question. "How did you know that?" I asked. "Because I have watched that man for 6 years," Greta said, "and I have never once seen him behave the way he behaved yesterday afternoon. He canceled a call with his accountant. He asked me twice what time you usually finished your errands. A man does not do those things because he is thinking about legal paperwork, Claire." Her words settled into me with an unsettling weight, confirming what I had already suspected, but had not yet allowed myself to fully believe. I busied myself with the supply list, avoiding her gaze, though I could feel her watching me with the patient curiosity of someone who already knew the answer, and was simply waiting for me to catch up to it myself. "Be careful," Greta said finally, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier teasing. "Men like Damien Cole do not fall carelessly, and they do not let go easily either. If something is happening between the two of you, it will not stay small for long." I understood exactly what she meant. In a house like this one, nothing stayed hidden for long, and nothing stayed simple either. I finished counting the supplies in silence, my mind circling back, again and again, to the moment in the front room the night before, to the way Damien had stepped so close that I could feel the warmth of him, even through my coat, to the words he had almost said before pulling them back at the last second. Whatever this was becoming between us, I understood now that it had already been noticed, and once something is noticed in a house full of watchful eyes, it rarely stays contained for long. That thought followed me through the rest of the morning, settling into the back of my mind like a stone dropped into deep water, its ripples still spreading long after the surface had gone still again. It was only the beginning of something neither of us could easily undo, and the days ahead would demand honesty from both of us, whether we were ready to give it or not. 3 days passed after that night in the front room, and in those 3 days, Damien Cole behaved like a man determined to prove that nothing unusual had happened between us at all. He kept to his study, spoke to me only about schedules and meals, and treated every interaction with the careful politeness of a stranger. I told myself this was for the best. I told myself, more than once, that I had imagined the intensity of that almost confession, that wine and moonlight had made me see something in his eyes that was never really there. I did not believe myself, not even for a moment, but it was easier to pretend. On the 4th day, everything changed again, though not in any way I could have predicted. I was in the garden behind the house, cutting fresh herbs for the evening meal, when I heard the front gate open and the crunch of gravel under unfamiliar footsteps. I looked up to see a man I did not recognize walking up the path toward the front door, tall, well-dressed, carrying himself with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. He caught sight of me kneeling among the herbs and smiled, an open, friendly smile that felt out of place against the quiet tension that had settled over the house in recent days. "Good afternoon," he said, stopping at the edge of the garden path. "I am looking for Mr. Cole. Would you happen to know if he is available?" I stood and brushed the soil from my hands. "He is in his study," I said. "May I ask who is calling?" "Nathan Bell," he said, extending a hand. "I am an old friend of his, from university. I was in the area and thought I would stop by unannounced, which I understand is not usually done with a man like Damien, but I have known him long enough to take the risk." There was something warm and easy about Nathan Bell, a quality that made conversation feel effortless in a way it rarely did in that house. I found myself smiling despite the strange tension of the last several days, and I walked him to the front entrance, chatting about small things, the weather, the garden, the quiet charm of the neighborhood. He asked my name, and I told him, and he repeated it back with a kind of genuine interest that felt refreshing after days of careful, guarded exchanges with Damien. I led Nathan into the front room and went to fetch Damien from his study, expecting nothing more than a brief interruption to an otherwise uneventful afternoon. What I did not expect was the reaction that crossed Damien's face when I told him who was waiting downstairs. "Nathan Bell is here," I said. Damien's expression shifted in an instant, the careful neutrality of the last 3 days replaced by something sharper, more alert. "What does he want?" Damien asked. "He said he is an old friend from university," I said. "He seemed pleasant enough." "Pleasant," Damien repeated, and there was an edge in his voice that I recognized immediately, the same edge that had colored his voice the night I mentioned my fake date. He rose from his desk with a controlled kind of urgency and walked past me toward the stairs without another word. I followed him down, curious despite myself, and found Nathan waiting in the front room exactly where I had left him, still wearing that easy smile, though it faltered slightly when Damien appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "Damien," Nathan said, extending his hand, "it has been too long." Damien did not take the offered hand right away. He studied Nathan with the same cold assessment he gave to everything that entered his house, and I noticed, with growing curiosity, that his eyes flicked briefly toward me before returning to his old friend. "Nathan," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "This is unexpected." "I was hoping to catch up," Nathan said, apparently unbothered by the cool welcome, "and I could not help noticing your lovely housekeeper on my way in. Claire, was it?" The temperature in the room dropped several degrees in an instant. I watched Damien's jaw tighten, the exact same way it had tightened when he first learned about my invented date, and I felt a strange, unwelcome thrill at the sight of it, because I understood now, with complete certainty, what I was witnessing. "Claire has work to attend to," Damien said, his voice flat and final. "Of course," Nathan said easily, though I caught the faint amusement in his eyes as he glanced between Damien and me, as though he had already guessed at something neither of us had said aloud. Another time, perhaps. I excused myself and retreated toward the kitchen, though I did not go far. I found myself lingering near the hallway, close enough to hear fragments of the conversation that followed, my curiosity too strong to resist. Nathan's voice carried easily through the old walls of the house, warm and confident, while Damien's responses came shorter, clipped, increasingly impatient. "I did not come here to discuss old times only," Nathan said at one point, his voice low but still audible. "I actually came to ask about your housekeeper. A friend of mine is opening a new restaurant downtown and is looking for someone with her particular skill set to help manage the front of house. I thought, given how impressive she seemed in our brief conversation, that she might be interested." There was a pause, long enough that I found myself holding my breath in the hallway, waiting for Damien's response. "She is not interested," Damien said finally, his voice tight with an emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "Should that not be her decision to make?" Nathan asked, and I could hear the faint challenge in his tone, as though he were testing exactly how far he could push before Damien's composure cracked entirely. I heard footsteps then, quick and deliberate, and I barely had time to step back from the hallway before Damien appeared, his eyes finding mine immediately, as though he had known all along that I was listening. "Claire," he said, "would you join us for a moment?" I walked back into the front room with my heart pounding, uncertain what I would find, and discovered Nathan watching the two of us with obvious interest, a slight, knowing smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Nathan tells me there is a job opportunity you might be interested in," Damien said, his voice carefully neutral, though I could hear the strain beneath it. "Managing the front of house at a new restaurant downtown." "That does sound interesting," I said carefully, watching Damien's face for any reaction. "I have always enjoyed working with people." Something flickered across Damien's expression, quick and unguarded, gone before Nathan could notice it, though I caught it clearly, because I had spent 8 months learning to read every small change in that carefully controlled face. It was not anger, exactly. It was something closer to fear, The kind of fear a man feels when something he values might slip away from him before he has found the courage to claim it. "Perhaps we could discuss the details over dinner sometime," Nathan said, looking directly at me now, his intentions unmistakable. "I would be happy to introduce you to the owner myself." I felt Damien go rigid beside me, though he said nothing, his hands curling slightly at his sides in a gesture he clearly tried to control. I looked between the two men, understanding now with complete clarity that I had accidentally created a situation far more complicated than the simple lie I had told days earlier, though this time the tension in the room had nothing to do with anything I had invented. "I would need to think about it," I said finally, choosing my words with care. "But thank you for the consideration." Nathan's smile widened slightly, as though he had gotten exactly the answer he expected, and he glanced once more at Damien before turning back toward the door. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need. I will leave my card with your employer, in case you change your mind." He said his goodbyes, warm and unhurried, and let himself out through the front door, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Damien did not speak for a long moment after the door closed. When he finally turned to look at me, his composure had cracked entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that I had never seen from him before. "Are you actually considering that offer?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "I do not know," I said honestly. "It would mean better hours, better pay, most likely, a chance to build something outside of this house." Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he would simply walk away again, retreat behind that familiar wall the way he always did, whenever our conversations approached anything real. Instead, he crossed the room toward me, closing the distance between us the same way he had that night after my fake date, until I had to tilt my head back to keep looking at him. "Do not take it," he said, and his voice had lost all of its earlier control, stripped down to something raw and honest that sent a shiver through my entire body. "Give me one good reason," I said, though my heart was already pounding with anticipation of what he might say. "Because I cannot imagine this house without you in it," he said, the words coming out fast and unguarded, as though he had been holding them back for far too long and could no longer manage the effort of containing them. "Because Nathan looked at you for exactly 2 minutes and I wanted to throw him out of my own home. Because I have spent 3 days pretending none of this matters when it is the only thing I can think about." The room seemed to hold its breath around us. I stood there staring up at him, at the raw honesty finally breaking through the careful control he wore like armor, and I felt something shift permanently in my chest, a door opening that I had been too afraid to push against myself. "Damien," I said softly. "Do not answer yet," he said quickly, stepping back slightly, as though suddenly aware of how much he had revealed. "I have said more than I meant to. Take the evening. Think about the job, if you must. But know that I meant every word." He turned and walked back toward the stairs before I could respond, leaving me standing alone in the front room for the second time that week, my heart racing, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I thought of Nathan's easy smile and his casual offer, of the card he had left on the side table with the restaurant owner's information, written in neat, confident handwriting. I thought, too, of the raw honesty in Damien's voice, the fear and longing he had finally allowed himself to show. I picked up Nathan's card from the side table and turned it over in my hands, studying the elegant print, the promise of a different kind of life waiting somewhere beyond the walls of this house. Then I set it down again, slowly, and made my way toward the kitchen to help Greta with dinner preparations, my thoughts too tangled to sort through properly. Greta took one look at my face when I walked into the kitchen and set down the knife she had been using to slice carrots. "Whatever happened out there," she said, "it is written all over you." I told her everything, the unexpected visitor, the job offer, the way Damien's composure had finally cracked in front of both of us. Greta listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful with every detail, until I finished and the kitchen fell quiet, except for the low simmer of a pot on the stove. "That man who came by," she said finally, "did he give his name as Nathan Bell?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" Greta wiped her hands on her apron and glanced toward the hallway, as though checking that no one else could hear her. "I have heard that name before," she said, lowering her voice. Not from Damien directly, but from the two men who come to handle his business papers. They mentioned it once, months ago, in a conversation they thought I was not listening too closely enough to understand. What did they say? I asked, my curiosity sharpening into something closer to concern. That Nathan Bell used to be close with Damien, back when they were young men just starting out, before Damien built everything he has now, Greta said, and that the friendship ended badly, over money, or perhaps over something else entirely. I never learned the full story, but I remember the way those two men lowered their voices when they spoke of him, the way people lower their voices when they are talking about someone they do not entirely trust. I turned this new information over in my mind, thinking of the easy, confident smile Nathan had worn, the casual way he had offered me a job within minutes of meeting me, the pointed comment about my employer that had seemed almost designed to provoke a reaction. If there was history between the two men, unresolved and unspoken, then Nathan's visit had not been the innocent reunion it appeared to be on the surface. Do you think he came here because of me? I asked, or because of something between him and Damien? Perhaps both, Greta said. Men like that rarely do anything for only one reason. I thought about that for the rest of the evening as I helped prepare dinner, my hands moving through familiar tasks while my mind circled around everything Greta had told me. When the meal was ready, I carried a tray up to Damien's study myself, instead of sending it up with one of the other staff, partly out of habit, and partly because I wanted to see his face again, to search it for whatever truth remained unspoken beneath the raw honesty he had already shown me. I found him standing at the window, looking out over the darkened garden, his shoulders set in the same rigid line they had held since Nathan's departure. He turned when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the tray sitting forgotten on the desk between us. Greta told me something interesting, I said finally, deciding there was no point in circling the subject carefully. She said you and Nathan used to be close, before whatever happened between you. Damien's expression shuddered slightly, though he did not deny it. That was a long time ago, he said. Long enough that it does not matter anymore? I asked. Or long enough that it still does? He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken despite the seriousness of the conversation. Nathan and I built the beginnings of this business together, he said finally. Two young men with more ambition than sense. When it came time to decide how far we were willing to go to protect what we had built, we wanted different things. He left. I stayed. We have not spoken in nearly 6 years, until this afternoon. And now he shows up unannounced, offering me a job, I said slowly, understanding beginning to take shape in my mind. Do you think that was really about me at all? I think Nathan does nothing without a reason, Damien said, and I think part of that reason was testing whether anything in this house still matters to me enough to provoke a reaction. He got his answer today, whether I intended to give it to him or not. The admission hung between us, quiet and heavy, and I found myself moving closer to him, without fully deciding to do so, drawn by something I could no longer pretend to ignore. If this is some kind of unfinished business between the two of you, I said, I do not want to be caught in the middle of it without understanding what I am actually part of. You are not caught in the middle of anything, Damien said, his voice softer now than I had ever heard it. Whatever happened between Nathan and me has nothing to do with what I feel for you. That much, at least, is entirely separate and entirely real. I studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the careful control he usually wore, and found instead something open and unguarded, a vulnerability he had kept hidden through 8 long months of careful distance between us. Then I want to understand the rest of it too, I said. Not tonight, perhaps, but eventually. Eventually, he agreed quietly, and something in the way he said the word felt like a promise neither of us was ready to fully name yet. I left the study soon after, carrying the empty tray back down to the kitchen, my mind turning over everything I had learned. Nathan's visit had cracked something open between Damien and me, forcing honesty into a relationship that had survived for 8 months on careful silence and unspoken rules. But it had also revealed a shadow from Damien's past that I did not yet understand, a history with consequences I could only begin to guess at. Whatever was growing between Damien and me was no longer something either of us could pretend to ignore. Nathan's unexpected visit had forced it into the open, and now, for better or worse, We would both have to decide what to do with the truth that had finally been spoken aloud, and with the questions that truth had left trailing behind it, unanswered and waiting. A week passed after Nathan's unexpected visit, and in that week something between Damien and me settled into a fragile, unspoken understanding. He no longer pretended the tension did not exist, and I no longer pretended I did not notice the way his eyes followed me through every room I entered. We had not spoken again of the words he confessed in the front room, but they sat between us constantly, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment either of us found the courage to address them directly. That moment arrived on a Thursday evening, though not in the way either of us expected. I was in the kitchen finishing the last of the dinner dishes when I heard raised voices coming from Damien's study, sharp and urgent in a way I had never heard before in that house. I set down the towel in my hands and moved toward the hallway, my heart already pounding with an instinct I could not quite explain, the same instinct that had warned me something was wrong before I had any real evidence of it. Two men I did not recognize stood near Damien's desk, both dressed in dark suits, both wearing expressions of controlled urgency that made the air in the room feel charged with danger. Damien stood behind his desk, his posture rigid, his face carved from the same cold stone I had seen the very first day I started working in his house, before I had learned to read the smaller emotions hidden beneath that careful exterior. "We received word an hour ago," one of the men was saying as I paused outside the door, careful to stay out of sight. "Bell has been talking to people he should not be talking to, making arrangements that suggest he intends to move against your interests directly, not just circle around them the way he has been doing." I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Nathan, how reliable is the source?" Damien asked, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow made the tension in the room feel even sharper. "Reliable enough that I would not ignore it," the second man said. "He has been asking questions about your household, specifically about the woman who works here, whether she has family, whether she has any connection to your business that could be used as leverage." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the doorframe for support, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just heard. The casual mention of leverage landing like a physical blow, Nathan's warm smile, his easy conversation in the garden, his offer of a job at a restaurant downtown, all of it took on a darker meaning in light of what these men were describing. Damien's expression had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that felt more dangerous than any outward display of anger could have been. "Increase the security around the house immediately," he said, "and find out exactly what Bell is planning before he has the chance to act on it." I stepped back from the doorway before anyone noticed me listening, my thoughts spinning too fast to settle on any single coherent idea. I made my way to my room on unsteady legs and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to process what I had overheard. Nathan Bell, the charming stranger who had walked into the garden with an easy smile, was apparently planning something against Damien that involved using me as a tool against him. I did not sleep well that night, and when I came down for my morning duties, I found the house already different in small but noticeable ways. Two additional men I did not recognize stood near the front entrance, their presence quiet but unmistakable. The usual open feeling of the garden had been replaced by something more guarded, curtains drawn tighter than usual, doors checked and rechecked. Damien found me in the kitchen before I had finished preparing his morning coffee, his expression carefully composed, though I could see the strain beneath it, now that I knew what to look for. "We need to talk," he said. "I already know," I said quietly, setting down the coffee pot. "I heard part of the conversation last night, about Nathan." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or concern that I had overheard something meant to stay contained within his study. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough to understand that this is more serious than an old friendship gone sour," I said. "Enough to understand that whatever happened between the two of you all those years ago has apparently not stayed in the past." Damien was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, stripped of its usual careful control. "Nathan and I did not simply drift apart over ambition," he said. "When we built this business together, there were decisions made, choices about how far we were willing to go to protect what we had built. I made those choices. Nathan did not agree with them, and when he left, he did not leave quietly. He took information with him, information that could have destroyed everything I had built if it had reached the wrong hands. Why did it not?" I asked. Because I made certain it never left his possession, Damien said, his eyes meeting mine, with an intensity that made the hair on my arms rise. And because for 6 years, he has kept that information as a kind of quiet threat, never used, never fully abandoned either. I believed we had reached an understanding, a distance that suited us both. His visit last week suggests that understanding may no longer hold. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, trying to absorb everything he had just told me. And you believe he wants to use me somehow, I said, as leverage against you. I believe it is possible, Damien said, and I will not pretend otherwise, because you deserve honesty, especially now. Which is why I need you to be careful, more careful than you have ever needed to be in this house before. The fear in his voice was unmistakable now, raw and unguarded, in a way that told me more about the depth of his feelings than any confession he could have spoken aloud. I looked at him across the kitchen, at the tension carved into every line of his face, and I felt something shift inside my chest, a certainty settling into place that had been building slowly since the night of my invented date. I am not going anywhere, I said quietly. Damien's expression softened slightly, though the worry did not fully leave his eyes. This is not something you should have to be brave about, he said. This is my past catching up with me, not yours. It became mine the moment Nathan looked at me in that garden and decided I might be useful to him, I said. I am already part of this, whether either of us intended it that way or not. He crossed the kitchen toward me then, closing the distance the way he had that night in the front room, and this time, he did not stop himself from reaching out, his hand finding mine across the small space between us, warm and steady, despite everything unfolding around us. I will not let anything happen to you, he said, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. I believe you, I said, and I meant it completely, though a small part of me understood, even then, that belief alone would not be enough to keep either of us safe from whatever Nathan Bell had set in motion. That afternoon, as I moved through my usual duties with an unfamiliar awareness of every shadow, every unfamiliar sound, I found myself thinking back to the ease of Nathan's smile in the garden, the casual way he had offered me an opportunity that seemed, in hindsight, far too convenient to be entirely innocent. I thought of the elegant card still sitting untouched on the side table, and I understood now why Damien's reaction to it had gone far deeper than simple jealousy over a rival's attention. By evening, the additional security around the house had settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm, and Damien called me into his study once more, this time with a request I had not expected. I need you to stay close to the house for the next several days, he said. No errands into the city, no unnecessary trips outside these walls. I know it is not what you want to hear, especially after everything that has already happened this week, but I cannot take unnecessary risks with your safety. I understand, I said, and I found that I meant it, though the walls of that house, which had always felt like a place of quiet routine, now carried a different weight entirely, charged with the possibility of danger lurking just beyond its careful boundaries. As I turned to leave the study, Damien spoke again, his voice softer than before. Claire, he said, and I paused in the doorway, turning back to face him. Whatever happens with Nathan, whatever comes of all of this, I need you to know that what I told you last week was true, every word of it. I know, I said quietly, and I stepped back into the room instead of leaving, closing the door softly behind me. We sat together for a while after that, not speaking of Nathan or the danger gathering somewhere beyond the walls of the house, but of smaller things instead, the kind of ordinary conversation that felt almost like a gift after days of tension. He asked about my mother, about the medical bills I had mentioned once in passing months earlier, and I found myself telling him more than I had ever intended to share with an employer, about the long nights at the hospital, about the fear of losing the one person who had raised me entirely on her own. You never told me the full extent of it, Damien said quietly, when I finished. Why not? Because it was not your responsibility to carry, I said. Because for 8 months, I told myself the safest thing I could do was keep a clear line between what happened in this house and what happened in the rest of my life. And now, he asked. Now I am not certain that line still exists, I admitted, and something in his expression softened at the honesty of it, the careful mask he wore around most of the world slipping further away in my presence than I had ever seen it slip before. He told me things too, that evening, fragments of a childhood spent watching his father struggle to keep a small business afloat, of the ambition that had driven him to build something larger, something that could never be taken from him, the way everything had once been taken from his father. I listened, understanding for the first time the shape of the man beneath the careful control, the fear that had built the walls around him, just as surely as ambition had built his empire. "We are not so different," I said quietly, once he had finished. "Both of us building careful walls to keep the people we love safe from the world outside. Perhaps that is why this frightens me more than anything Nathan could threaten directly," he said, "because you are already inside those walls, and I do not know how to protect what I have never had to protect before." The vulnerability in his voice settled something inside me, a certainty I had been circling for days, finally taking firm shape. "Then let me help carry it," I said. "Whatever comes next, I do not want to watch it happen from the outside." He studied me for a long moment, the lamplight catching the deep blue of his eyes, and something passed between us that felt heavier than words, an understanding neither of us needed to speak aloud to recognize. Outside, somewhere beyond the careful boundaries of that house, Nathan Bell was moving pieces into place for reasons I still did not fully understand. But inside that study, for the first time since I had come to work in his house, I felt something closer to safety than fear. "We will face it together then," Damien said finally, his voice quiet but resolute, and I believed him completely, though neither of us yet knew how close that promise would come to being tested in the days that followed. Before I left the study that night, he walked me to the door himself, something he had never done before in 8 months of careful distance between us. At the threshold he paused, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe near my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "Lock your door tonight," he said quietly, "not because I believe anyone can reach you inside these walls, but because it will let me sleep knowing you did." "I will," I said, and for a moment neither of us moved, the space between us charged with everything still unspoken, everything too fragile yet to name fully. Then he stepped back, allowing me to pass, and I climbed the narrow staircase to my room, with my heart still racing, replaying the evening over and over, as though trying to memorize every detail of it before sleep could blur the edges. I stepped back into the room instead of leaving, closing the door softly behind me, because whatever storm Nathan Bell was preparing to unleash on that carefully guarded house, I understood now that I did not want to face it from a safe distance. I wanted to face it standing beside the man who had finally, after 8 long months of careful silence, allowed me to see exactly what he had been guarding underneath. The call came just after midnight, 3 days after Damien had walked me to my door and asked me to lock it for his own peace of mind. I woke to the sound of urgent voices below my window, footsteps moving quickly across the gravel path, and my heart was already racing before I had fully opened my eyes. I pulled on a robe and hurried down the back staircase, finding the front room filled with more people than I had ever seen there at once, Damien standing at the center of it, phone pressed to his ear, his face carved from the same cold stone I remembered from our very first tense conversation about my invented date. "What is happening?" I asked, catching Greta's arm as she hurried past with an armful of blankets. "Nathan Bell was seen near the property line an hour ago," Greta said, her voice low and urgent. "The men caught sight of him on the security cameras before he disappeared into the trees at the edge of the garden. Damien has had everyone up since then." My stomach dropped. I moved further into the front room, and Damien's eyes found mine immediately across the crowded space, something fierce and protective flashing across his features, before he returned his attention to the phone call, issuing quiet, controlled instructions to whoever was on the other end. When he finally ended the call, he crossed the room to where I stood, his hand finding mine without hesitation, without any of the careful distance he had maintained for 8 long months before that week. "You need to stay upstairs," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled worry, "where it is safest." "I am not hiding while you face this alone," I said. "This is exactly the situation I warned you about," he said, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. "Nathan is here for a reason, and I do not intend to let you become part of whatever he is planning. I already am part of it, I said. Whether either of us wanted that or not, it happened the moment he looked at me in that garden and decided I might be useful. Hiding upstairs will not change that now. Before Damien could respond, one of the men near the front door called out sharply, and the entire room shifted its attention toward the entrance, where the heavy wooden door had begun to open slowly, pushed from the outside with a deliberate, unhurried confidence that made my skin crawl. Nathan Bell stepped into the front room as though he were arriving for another casual visit, his easy smile still in place, though something colder lurked beneath it now, something I had not noticed during our first meeting in the garden. Two men flanked him, their expressions far less friendly than his own, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees the moment they crossed the threshold. "Damien," Nathan said, his voice carrying the same warm familiarity as before, as though 6 years of silence, and whatever dangerous business he was now conducting had never happened at all. "I did try knocking politely last week. I thought perhaps a different approach might finally get your full attention." "You have my attention," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous in a way I had never heard from him before, every trace of warmth stripped away entirely. "What do you want, Nathan?" "What I have always wanted," Nathan said, his eyes drifting briefly toward me, before returning to Damien. "A fair share of what we built together, before you decided I was no longer necessary to the arrangement. I have been patient for 6 years. I find my patience has finally run out." "You left," Damien said. "That was your choice, not mine." "I left because you made choices I could not live with," Nathan said, his voice sharpening now, the friendly mask finally slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "But I built the foundation this business still stands on, and I intend to be compensated for that, one way or another." I felt the tension in the room thicken into something almost unbearable, every person present holding perfectly still, waiting to see which direction the confrontation would break. Damien's hand tightened around mine, though his voice remained perfectly level when he spoke again. "And if I refuse," he said. Nathan's gaze shifted fully toward me then, cold and calculating in a way that made every instinct in my body scream danger. "Then perhaps I find another way to make my point," he said quietly. "Something that will get your attention far more effectively than old business grievances ever could." "Do not," Damien said, and the warning in his voice carried a weight that silenced the entire room for a long, tense moment. I stepped forward before I fully decided to, pulling gently against Damien's grip until he released my hand, some instinct telling me that hiding behind him now would only make the situation more dangerous, not less. I looked directly at Nathan, forcing my voice to stay steady despite the fear pounding through my chest. "Whatever quarrel exists between the two of you," I said, "it has nothing to do with me. I am not a piece to be moved in this argument." Nathan studied me for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering across his expression before it hardened again into cold calculation. "Brave words," he said, "but you misunderstand your position here. You became useful the moment Damien let it show how much he cares about you. That is simply how these things work." He took a step further into the room, and immediately, the men positioned throughout the space shifted, closing ranks, the air charged with the possibility of violence that had been building since the moment Nathan first crossed the threshold. Damien moved to stand directly between Nathan and me, his posture rigid with a barely controlled fury I had never witnessed from him before. "This ends now," Damien said. "Whatever you believe you are owed, threatening the people in my household is not a path that leads anywhere you want to go." "I am simply here to talk," Nathan said, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of false innocence, "though I would remind you that talking has already failed once this week." The standoff stretched on, tense and fragile, every person in the room waiting for the moment it would break one direction or another. I watched Damien's men position themselves carefully around the perimeter, watched Nathan's own companions shift their weight in preparation, and understood with sudden clarity that this confrontation could end in ways none of us would be able to take back. Then, unexpectedly, it was Greta who broke the silence, stepping forward with a phone held out in front of her, her expression grim but determined. "I already called the authorities 20 minutes ago," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the tense room. "They should be arriving any moment now. Whatever business the two of you have to settle, I suggest you settle it somewhere that does not involve threatening a house full of people who have nothing to do with your disagreement." Nathan's expression flickered with something close to genuine surprise, and for the first time since he had entered the room, I saw a flash of uncertainty cross his composed features. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, the sound of approaching sirens began to carry through the quiet night air. "This is not finished," Nathan said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, as he stepped back toward the door, his companions falling into step behind him. "But I will grant you tonight, Damien, for old time's sake." He paused at the threshold, his gaze finding mine one last time, something unreadable passing across his expression, before he finally spoke again. "Take care of yourself," he said, his tone almost gentle despite everything that had just unfolded. "Not everyone who shows kindness has good intentions behind it." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the garden with his companions close behind, and the front room seemed to exhale all at once, the tension breaking apart into scattered relief and lingering fear in equal measure. The authorities arrived minutes later, and Damien spent nearly an hour speaking with them in low, careful tones, while I sat wrapped in a blanket Greta had pressed into my hands, my body finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. When the last of the officers finally left, promising increased patrols near the property for the coming weeks, the house fell into an exhausted, uneasy quiet. Damien found me still sitting in the front room, the blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, staring at the spot near the door where Nathan had stood only an hour before. He sat down beside me without a word, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him beside me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke at all. "I am sorry," he said finally. "I never meant for any of this to reach you." "It already had," I said quietly, "long before tonight." The moment I told that first lie about having a date, everything between us started moving toward this point, whether either of us understood it yet or not. Damien turned to look at me then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, stripped of every careful wall he usually kept in place. "Was it truly a lie?" he asked quietly. "That first night?" I felt my breath catch, understanding immediately what he was really asking. "Yes," I admitted softly. "There was no man waiting for me at that restaurant. I invented the entire evening because I wanted to see how you would react, because some part of me already suspected there was something between us I was too afraid to name directly." He was quiet for a long moment, processing the confession, and then, unexpectedly, something close to a smile broke across his exhausted features, the first genuine smile I had ever seen from him in 8 months. "All of this," he said. "The documents, the tension, nearly losing my composure entirely in front of my own staff. Because of a date that never existed at all." "I am sorry," I said, though I found myself smiling too, despite everything that had happened that night. It seemed harmless at the time. "It was the most honest thing that has happened in this house in 8 months, he said, reaching over to take my hand again, his thumb tracing gently across my knuckles. "I have spent so long keeping careful distance from everyone around me, certain that letting anyone close would only give them power to hurt me. Then you walked into this house and made that distance impossible to maintain, whether I wanted to admit it or not." I looked at him in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, at the man who had revealed more of himself in 1 week than in 8 months of careful silence before it, and I understood with complete certainty that whatever fear had driven that original lie, it had led us somewhere neither of us could have predicted, somewhere far more honest than either of us had been prepared for. "Nathan's threat has not disappeared," Damien said quietly. "There will be more to face in the days ahead, and I cannot promise you this house will always feel as safe as it once did. I am not asking for safety," I said. "I am asking to face whatever comes next honestly, standing beside you instead of hiding from it." He studied me for a long moment, and then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead, the gesture carrying more tenderness than any words could have managed after everything the night had demanded of us both. "Then we face it together," he said quietly. "Starting now, and continuing for as long as you will have me." "I have a date tonight," I said softly, echoing the words that had started everything a week earlier, though this time I meant them differently. A promise instead of a lie. Damien's smile widened, warm and real in a way I had never seen from him before that week began. Then let it be a real one this time, he said, his voice carrying a lightness that felt like the beginning of something entirely new. No lies, no pretending. Just the truth, finally, after everything it took to get here. We sat together in the quiet front room for a long while after that, watching the darkness slowly give way to morning through the tall windows, neither of us in any hurry to move or break the fragile peace that had finally settled over the house. Greta appeared once with a tray of tea, setting it down without a word, though the small, satisfied smile she wore as she left the room told me she had understood exactly what she was witnessing. "Do you think he will come back?" I asked eventually, my voice quiet in the stillness. Damien considered the question carefully before answering, his thumb still tracing gentle patterns across my knuckles. "Perhaps," he said. "Nathan does not give up easily, and pride has always mattered more to him than caution. But he saw tonight that this house will not be an easy target, and that matters more than he will admit." "And if he does come back," I asked, "what happens then?" "Then we face it, exactly as we did tonight," Damien said, his voice steady, with a conviction that settled some of the remaining fear still lingering in my chest. "Only this time, I will not spend 3 days pretending the truth does not exist between us, before I finally say it aloud." I smiled at that, the exhaustion of the long night beginning to catch up with me now that the danger had passed. "I suppose I owe Nathan some strange thanks," I said. "If he had not walked into that garden, I do not know how much longer we would have continued pretending nothing was happening between us." "A dangerous way to find honesty," Damien said, though the corner of his mouth curved upward slightly at the observation. "I would have preferred a gentler path toward the same conclusion." "We can still choose a gentler path from here forward," I said. He turned to look at me fully then, the early light catching the deep blue of his eyes, softer now than I had ever seen them, stripped of every careful wall that had once stood between us. "I would like that very much," he said quietly. The house slowly began to wake around us as the morning progressed, the quiet sounds of Greta moving through the kitchen, the distant footsteps of the men Damien had stationed near the perimeter, completing their final rounds before the day shift arrived to replace them. Life continued, ordinary and steady, even after a night that had upended everything I thought I understood about my place within these walls. Later that morning, once I had finally changed out of my robe and returned to my usual duties, I found a small folded note waiting on my dresser, written in Damien's careful, precise handwriting. I unfolded it slowly, my heart lifting unexpectedly at the simple words written inside. "Dinner tonight," it read. "No documents, no sudden emergencies, only the truth, and perhaps a proper date this time, if you will have me." I pressed the note against my chest for a moment, laughing quietly to myself at how far we had traveled from that first tense conversation over a single lie about an evening out. I thought of the fear in Nathan's cold eyes, of the danger that still lingered somewhere beyond the garden walls, waiting perhaps to return another day. But standing there in the quiet morning light, holding a note that promised honesty instead of secrets, I found I was no longer afraid of whatever challenges still lay ahead. That evening, I dressed carefully once more, though this time there was no lie waiting to be told, no invented stranger to explain away, only the simple, honest truth of what had grown between Damien and me across one extraordinary week. He met me at the bottom of the stairs, dressed impeccably as always, though his expression carried none of the guarded distance I had grown so accustomed to during my first 8 months in that house. "You look nice," he said, echoing the words he had spoken the very first night this had all begun, though this time his voice carried none of the reluctance it had held before. "Thank you," I said, taking the arm he offered. We walked out together into the cool evening air, past the careful security that still watched the perimeter of the property, past the shadow of everything that had happened, and everything that might still come. Whatever Nathan Bell intended for the future, whatever threats still lingered unresolved somewhere beyond those garden walls, I understood now that Damien and I would face them exactly as we had promised each other in the quiet hours after that long, dangerous night, together, honestly, and without the careful lies that had once kept us so carefully apart. Outside, the first gray light of dawn had long since given way to a full, golden evening, chasing away every trace of the darkness that had gathered around us in the days before. I walked beside Damien Cole, The man I had once considered nothing more than a difficult employer, now something far more complicated and far more real. And I understood that whatever challenges still waited for us beyond that evening, we would meet them exactly as we had learned to meet everything else between us, together, honestly, and unafraid of whatever truth still remained to be spoken.